Hello, hello. Welcome to Heart of the Tribe. My name is Shel Wagner, and I'm so glad you came to join us today. This promises to be a very interesting and enlightening discussion. And I just want you to go ahead and welcome with me my guest, Dr. Stephen Pidgeon.
Hi, Shel.
Hi, Dr. Pidgeon. Good to see you today.
Yeah, it's great to be here with you. I just love your opening. It's just so wonderful, the Heart of the Tribes, and to bless the tribes with such a wonderful statement of scripture. It's beautiful.
Thank you so much. That was those scriptures were all dropped in my heart in one night in 2003.
Yeah, beautiful. They're just wonderful. It's such a blessing for each of the tribes to see it and to know of your own heritage, to know what the blessing is. It's wonderful. Yeah, tremendous.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm excited about today's presentation. I wanted to share just something real briefly about like why this was really on my heart and why I wanted to discuss this, if you don't mind. I'm just going to add this real quick and tell you why this was really on my heart. So we're trying to take a look at the culture and the people and get some understanding about Russia. And this was really what was on my heart. I've heard you talk about these three obelisks before, right? That talk about the different power, representations of power. And there's a verse out in the chapter 7 of Daniel. And it says, in the first year of Baal Shazar, am I saying that right?
Yeah. Belshazzar.
Yeah. King of Babel, Daniel had a dream and visions of his head upon his bed. Then he wrote the dream and told the sum of the matters. Daniel spoke and said, I saw in my vision by night, and behold, the four winds of the heavens strove upon the great sea. And four great beasts came up from the sea, diverse one from another. The first was like a lion and had eagle's wings. As soon as I read that, I thought, in my brain, and I'm just giving you like, where's my understanding? Then I can't wait to hear what you have to share. But the first thing that hit me was, this is like a marriage of Israel and the United States of America. This lion with the two eagle's wings carrying it along. That's kind of what I saw, right? I beheld till the wings thereof were plucked, like the destruction and the undoing of the power of that kingdom. And it was lifted up from the earth and made to stand upon the feet as a man, and a man's heart was given to it. I'm not sure what to think about that. But then, and behold, another beast, a second like to a bear, and it raised up itself on one side, and it had three ribs in its mouth of it between the teeth of it. And they said thus unto it, arise and devour much flesh. When I read that, as I've always grown up, I was always taught the Hal Lindsey version of Gog and Magog. And I loved your discussion on that last week, to get a different look. And I've heard you share about these three obelisks of power before. And I've always thought, are these the three ribs that are in the mouth of the bear? Is this what BRICS is all about? And is this where we're at? So I just wanted to share why this whole thing was on my heart. I do believe that we're watching the United States of America fall. It's the saddest thing in the world to see. I believe that Yah's justice is perfect. He's always perfect in his justice when he decides to judge a nation. And he uses sometimes leaders, he calls leaders into power. He decides who's going to be in power. And it doesn't mean that person's good or bad. It's who he's chosen, to use according to scripture at that particular time for his own purposes. And his justice is perfect, and I trust in that. But it is a very interesting time that we are living in, and there's a whole lot going on. And I know that there's a lot on your heart about this entire subject, so I can't wait to hear what you have to say about all that.
Well, thank you, Shel, for opening this venue for me to be able to discuss this very important issue. And it really blesses me that you would ask me about this. My ties with Russia began many, many years ago when I was child. When we first came to Alaska, I was 8 years old when we came here. And it was such a culture shock for me to come to America's Siberia, which is what it really is, right? It's an Arctic place and it's an Arctic lifestyle. And I was born in California. I was
Wow.
a dark brown California kid running around in the sun, and all of a sudden I'm seeing snow for the first time. And our very first winter, we saw 55 below zero. And the following winter, it was 65 below. And I wasn't quite prepared for that really dramatic adventure into the Arctic, really very dramatic. Well, we came to Anchorage. We came to Anchorage right after the great earthquake. And Anchorage was really reeling because it had been destroyed from its own wickedness, by the way.
Yeah.
And but in its destruction, I remember visiting a house, and we went into this house, and I saw for the first time a samovar, and there was a samovar on top of this counter. And my dad was telling me about, he was working in Kenai at the time, and he said, "Oh yeah, we have to come down to Kenai, and I will show you the old Russian churches that are there." And we went down, and Kenai was one of the first settlements that the Russians held. And there were two Orthodox churches there. The original one, which was really a little tiny log cabin, if you will, and then the one that they had built later. And the Russian influence was really very dramatic in Anchorage and very dramatic in South Central Alaska, very strong. To this day, it's very strong. And so at any rate, when I turned 13, I was 13, 1967, and that was the 100-year anniversary of the purchase of Alaska. And so there was money given to present a show celebrating a musical celebrating the 100-year anniversary of Alaska's purchase. And a couple of guys, Frank Brink and Willard Strait, got together and they put together this 3-hour presentation called Toyon of Alaska. And Toyon of Alaska was a musical about Alexander Baranov, who was the first Russian governor of Alaska. And so here I am at 13 in this big Russian production. It was in English, of course, but it was a huge production. And my friend Kurt Riemann, he recently wrote me, and he sent me, he had the archives of the old program with my name in it, my sister's name in it, my mother's name in it. And he had the archives, all the archives from this production, Toyon of Alaska. Now, interestingly enough, the artist who did the cover for that program, for the show, would later, I think it was 2 years later, she did the designs for the artwork for Alaska Airlines. So you might, when you look at Alaska Airlines, you see basically an Eskimo on the tail.
Right.
Well, that was her design. And originally there were two. There was a prospector, and then there was an Inuit or Inupiat person on the tail. And the Inupiat person is the one that stuck. The prospector went away. But this was 1969. And of course, when Alaska Airlines first opened up, they advertised, quote unquote, samovar service, right? When they first opened. So we'd had this tremendous Russian influence growing up here. Well, okay, that's fine and dandy. But as later progressed in the late 80s and the early 90s, I was being invited to perform music in Russia. We were supposed to play the New Year's Eve party in Vladivostok, which I didn't go to. Which thankfully I didn't go to because the mayor that had invited us was assassinated that following month. Vladivostok was rougher than Anchorage, which is really hard to believe, but because it's rough. But so, and I had been a pianist, I'd been a pianist for many years at this point. And, but my piano technique was really suffering because I was playing with wrong technique and I really had a wrong idea about the piano. And so anyway, I had heard that this Russian had blown into Anchorage, and her name was Svetlana Velichko, and absolutely brilliant Russian pianist. She had graduated from the Moscow Conservatory, and this is the same conservatory from which Rachmaninoff graduated.
Wow!
And it's the only one in the history of the conservatory to graduate from the conservatory and to be invited to teach at the conservatory upon graduation. Absolutely brilliant pianist and wonderful person, gentle of heart, and such a brilliant pianist. I mean, she used to amaze me. She'd lean over my shoulder and do things with her hands, the technique that was like, I didn't believe that you could even do that, let alone watch her do it over my shoulder, standing up, And anyway, so when I sat down to play and I said, I can't play that. And she said, yes, you can. You have all the technique you need. You're just in your own way. And so she proceeded to show me the Russian way of playing the piano, so much different than the French way that I had been taught. And she said, the music must come from the heart, not from the mind, but from the heart. And you must not block the music from coming from the heart through your hands by tightening up your muscles and doing this. And I mean, when I walked in the door to her studio, she sat down at the piano. She took one finger and went, "Tung." She played one note on this piano, "Tung." And I just looked at her and I said, how did you do that? How did you get that sound to come out of that piano like that? And at that time I was playing basically two dynamics, loud and louder, And she said, look, there are 100 dynamics on the piano, 100, from piano pianissimo all the way to forte fortissimo, and all points in between. And you need to be able to move your hands back and forth through these dynamics, right? So then Sveta, she invited her friend from the Moscow Conservatory, Victor Bunin was his name, to come to Anchorage to run a masterclass. And he heard me play, and because I was playing Rachmaninoff etudes at the time, and of course the music of Rachmaninoff, and this is something else that had happened to me too, was of course I fell in love with Russian literature. So I read a lot of Dostoevsky and a lot of Tolstoy. I don't know if you've ever had the chance to read War and Peace. It's a tremendous book, and of course the English translation lacks, and of course Anton Chekhov, and of course Boris Pasternak. Dr. Zhivago.
I love Dr. Zhivago.
Oh, yeah. And Zhivago, I mean, Zhivago, of course, the movie is very romanticized, right? But the thing was, yeah. But the thing that was so incredible about Boris Pasternak is that he published a book in Russia, in the Soviet Union, that was quoting the Gospel of Matthew, which was absolutely, I mean, he could have been murdered for that, right?
Right.
No problem. And of course, I used to follow this writer named Alicia Rosenbaum, whose pen name was Ayn Rand.
Yes.
And of course, reading We the Living, which is her, it's a quasi-autobiography, somewhat, of her life in St. Petersburg before she left, which was called Petrograd before the revolution. And so, all of this, understanding, and reading Dostoevsky's The Idiot, right? Lev Nikolaevich Mishkin, and his adventures with Anastasia Filipovna, and of course all of these people, right? So I was just completely devolved into all of these Russian names and this Russian life and the Russian way of things, and trying to understand this. And of course, Winston Churchill tried to say, well, look, Russia is an enigma wrapped within a mystery. Well, Churchill did not understand Russians or the Russian way at all. He understood nothing. And so as a consequence, and of course, Russia remained a mystery and does remain a mystery in Britain, even to this day. And they really closed their mind to who are these people, right? And what are they doing? But I was never closed to this. And so Sveta told me, she says, you should go to Moscow. She said, you can stay in my apartment. You can have my apartment. You can stay in my apartment in Moscow. I'm staying here. You can go and stay in Moscow for a while and get to know the people. And I'm like, go to Moscow? I don't think so. And I was really kind of, I'm not really going to be going to Russia. Well, then, of course, I started into mission work, right? Because I was invited to become a missionary, right, of the gospel. And the very first mission trip was to Russia. And I'm thinking, well, what are you talking about, me going to Russia? I was planning on going to Italy, not Russia, right? And so anyway, we go to Russia, and I got off the plane and stood on the soil there at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow. And of course, we got a very interesting introduction to Moscow. We got on the bus, we're going through town. And as we're coming through the Leningradsky Prospect, the road leading into downtown, we see the vice mayor of Moscow had just been involved in a shootout with a bunch of mafia. And his two bodyguards had killed the three guys that were trying to assassinate him. Right there on the side of the road. This is day one, right?
Wow.
In Moscow. Oh, yeah. A violent place, right? Moscow at that time was a very violent place. And Moscow had not undergone the change-ups that it has undergone now. So it was still Soviet Moscow. And what I mean by that is that Moscow had the 7 Leningradsky buildings, or Stalinisky buildings, rather. There were 7 buildings in town that they had red stars on top of them. They were called the Stalinisky buildings, and no building could exceed their height anywhere in Moscow. And they dominated the 7 entrances into the old city. So the Moscow University, the Ukraini Hotel, Gastinitsia, and so on and so forth. And so anyway, I'm looking at these places, and at this time, Russia, for the most part, was pretty dull brown, right? I mean, you look at Russia, it was just kind of dull brown, even though the city of Moscow is very, very enchanting. But one thing you notice as soon as you're in Moscow is that look at all these churches. I mean, it's churches for days and days and days. And, you know, you'll have a little tiny, what they call the Church of the Intercession, which would be just a small church on maybe a lot, and it's got a big tower on it. And then you'll have the larger cathedrals, right? And of course, we were staying a block away from Red Square, Krasnaya Ploshchad. And in the middle of Red Square is Sankt Vasil Sabor, which is the most beautiful church in the world, in my opinion. This is the one with the colorful onion domes, you know?
Right.
And I saw that place and I just went, that is just absolutely spectacular. You know, just, everything about it is just spectacular, you know. But then we got invited to do a tour of the Kremlin, and we would go inside the Kremlin. And yes, we went into the armory and looked at the history and all this, and the Russian jewels and the Fabergé eggs and all of this kind of thing. But we come out of there and we visited 4 major churches inside the Kremlin. And I'm thinking, what? Stalin didn't tear down these churches inside the Kremlin? He couldn't. There was no way he could. When you're talking about the Church of the Archangel Michael, which is where all the czars prior to Peter the Great were buried.
Wow.
Then you have the bell tower of Ivan the Terrible, which is this huge bell tower. And then you have the Church of the Annunciation, which is where all the czars' children were baptized. And then you have the Church of the Assumption, which where all the patriarchs of the Russian Orthodox Church are buried. And we went into the Church of the Assumption, and it was just a wall of icons, you know, on the back wall. Each one of those icons are so precious, they're invaluable, each one of them, you know. Anyway, amazing things. And so I'm looking at this, and of course, as I meet the Russian people, I'm finding people, like, to give you an example. One of the gals on the bus, we were coming in from the airport, and she eats a little 2-pack of saltine crackers, okay? And she takes that little plastic wrapper, she drops it on the floor of the bus. We get off the bus, we're checking in the hotel, and the bus driver comes in and walks right up to her with the wrapper and said, "You left something in the bus."
Wow.
Okay. All right. To give you an example. And, but nonetheless, to try to be welcomed into the Russian culture, they were very standoffish for Americans, because even our missionary team were very obnoxious, very, we're so superior to you. We know what it means to be men, and you don't, and all of this kind of thing, which was just ridiculous. And I wasn't of that nature. That wasn't my style at all. My style was to come alongside these people and to just get to know them. And it took a while, but I made some very good friends in Kursk, and namely David and Ina Lisitsyn, very good friends. And so because they became such good friends, because they trusted me, I got invited to their house to come in to sit down for dinner. Now, to me, this was a huge blessing to be invited to somebody's house for dinner. You know, we just sat there and we had a couple of hot dogs and some rice, you know. But it was wonderful to be with them, to share that time together, to share the Russian life together, you know. And one of my good friends, I would call him a good friend, is Yuri Mikhailovich, Pastor Yuri, who was the head of St. Peter's Church there that we did a lot of evangelical work with. And Yuri Mikhailovich, he lost his firstborn son. His firstborn son died from sinus surgery on the table. I think he was 25 years old when he died.
Wow.
And they have since lost their youngest son as well. But Yuri was such a great guy, man. And this guy had a voice that was just unbelievable. I mean, when he starts talking, you could hear him from a half a mile away. Huge, huge, powerful voice, And so Yuri and I, Yuri was doing all the baptisms in the same river there in Kursk. And anyway, Yuri came to visit after his son had died. And, he didn't want to talk about the kind of tragedy that he went through with the loss of his son, right?
Right.
With, with the primogenitor, right? He'd lost his son. But nonetheless, he and I sang in Russian, give thanks. Kvala tibye nash Gospod, kvala tibye Bog Svetoy, kvala za Isusa Sinatva Yevo, right? And so he and I, he and I are singing, give thanks with a grateful heart. And we're singing it full, just me and him, singing it full blast, right?
Yeah.
And he knew, and his good friend was a fellow named Alexander Alexandrovich, and he ran the hotel where we used to stay, and this particular, and I asked him about Alex last time I saw him. I said, where's Alexander Alexandrovich? He said, well, he died, he passed away, right? But he ran this hotel called the Nightingale Hotel. And anyway, and then of course, one of the guys that we met there in Kursk, his name was Dmitry. He shows up. We were going over to visit Alexander Alexandrovich, who had given us his hotel really for the whole mission team, made it available, and said, "You guys can stay here, and you're getting it at discount rates, and I'm going to serve you dinner every night, and you basically have the run of the place, right?" And which was tremendous on his part to do that, right, for a bunch of Americans. And anyway, so to thank him, Yuri Mikhailovich asked Dmitry, would you come in and join us for a dinner? We want to do a dinner for Alexander Alexandrovich and honor him for doing this for us. Would you come in and play? Well, Dmitry comes in playing balalaika, right, the 3-string instrument. Well, Dmitry was a virtuoso. He was a virtuoso. And I'm watching him play this balalaika, and I was just like, this, it was just a dream come true to hear the balalaika played like this, So anyway, this was in 2002. And so no matter what was going to happen, Yah had intended me to visit Russia.
Mm-hmm.
And so since then, of course, I came back several times, and I made trips into some very difficult areas in Russia. I went to a town called Nalchik, which is in the province called Kabardino-Balkaria. And Kabardino-Balkaria is in the North Caucasus, and this is all Muslim area. Whether you're talking Chechnya, like it goes if you go from the Caspian Sea to the Black Sea, along the top of the Caucasus. Okay.
Let me see if I can get us a little map up so we can see what you're talking about.
That would be great if you can do that. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So if you look over here, you can see over here in the left-hand corner, you see this town, Astrakhan. Astrakhan. Do you see that at the north end of the Caspian Sea? Right there, yeah. Astrakhan.
Right.
Now, so you see the line that's at a diagonal there between the brown and the light tan here to the left of Astrakhan? To the left of Astrakhan.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
Yeah, right there. This a little bit south there. A little bit south. Yeah, keep going a little bit more south. Now go to your left there. You see that diagonal line right there?
Uh-huh.
Okay, that's where the Caucasus Mountains run.
Okay.
Now, this area, in order of the oblast through here, is you have Krasnodar, which is this Novorossiysk, is there, right, Krasnodar. And then you have Cherkessia, and then you have Kabardino-Balkaria, and then you have what's called Alana, or North Ossetia, and then you have Ingushetia, and then you have Chechnya, where the Chechens are from, right? And then you have Dagestan, and Astrakhan is in Dagestan. Okay. Astrakhan was the old Mongol capital that controlled this whole area. The Russians had to defeat the Mongols to create the Russian Empire. And they did. They did under Ivan III. So anyway, we go down here. This is all Muslim area. It's all Muslim, with the exception of North Ossetia. And we were in a very difficult place, Nalchik, and we did some discussions at some of the high schools there, and we visited a couple of the villages. We were up in the Balkar region of the country, and up in the Caucasus. And of course, Yuri Makhailovich is telling me, you need to go to Georgia. You need to go to Gruzia, they call it, Gruzia. You need to go to Georgia. And of course, the Georgians call the place Sakarbelo. But nonetheless, I did end up going to Georgia. And I went there 4 years in a row to visit the believers and the brothers and sisters there. And I had many really good friends, Gennady Romanadze and Zali Tkeshirishvili and Bishop Olegi and others. But in Russia itself, when we talk about the culture, Yah wanted me to understand the culture. Mm-hmm. And so I began to understand the culture and look at this. And as I began to understand the culture, to understand Russia is not an easy thing to do. And you really cannot understand Russia until you recognize that. So I'm just going to try to give you a little bit of the background.
Yeah.
The when the church was formed, the Christian church under the name Christos, it was formed in Constantinople by Constantine, the Council of Nicaea, 325 AD. And this church developed 7 Constantinian councils to run the church. And these 7 were governing all of Christianity. And Rome was brought in under this tenure because at that time, Constantinople was the capital of the entire empire.
Right.
But Rome began to pull away immediately because Rome began to assert itself as, we're more important than Constantinople. And so, but when you look at the authorship of the New Testament was written in Greek at the command of Constantine, who demanded 50 copies in Greek from Eusebius around 385 AD. Now, Eusebius would also craft the Codex Vaticanus in Latin for the Roman Church, but primarily the scripture was written in Greek. Mm-hmm. And so this was the foundation of the New Testament, and the aspect of what we call the eastern part of the Roman Empire was Greek speaking. They were not Latin speaking. And so the language was based on Cyrillic, not on the Arabic lettering that we see in the West. And interestingly enough, the Cyrillic of the Greek Cyrillic was a derivative of Paleo-Hebrew, and the Paleo-Ivrite as expressed in both the Etruscan alphabet and in the Colburn alphabet in the British Isles. These were the 2 places that were using that alphabet continuously for all these years. And the Greek Cyrillic would derive from the Paleo, with the Paleo Aleph, and how that becomes the Greek Alpha, right? Oh. Or Paleo Beta becomes the Greek Beta, and so on. Right. And so, so this Cyrillic alphabet is the language of the New Testament. Now, the Byzantine Empire, there would be a split between the Western Empire and the Eastern Empire, and it was mostly under Constantine's grandson who caused the split as he began to loot the Western Empire for purposes of the Eastern Empire. This is what was going on. This is the unknown story, but this is what was happening. And the West was really quite infuriated about it. One of the people who would take up the banner of Western Rome to try to hold the empire together was the first King Arthur, who would fight on the continent of Europe to hold the Roman Empire together in around 390 AD. But he would be killed in battle in Germany, and ultimately Western Rome would collapse. It would not hold on to its politics. Eastern Rome, on the other hand, would continue until 1453. 1453. So you see that, and it would become known as Byzantium, or the Byzantine Empire. And the Byzantine Empire, when it was at its height, controlled all of North Africa and controlled all of the Levant, controlled all of the Balkans, and had to reach up into Austria, and and controlled all of the Turkish Anatolian Peninsula, and so forth. But the encroaching agent was the Ottomans, namely Muhammad. He was not the only encroaching agent, however, because the Mongols would sweep across all of Russia, and they would sweep all the way into Central Europe. And they were imposing at the edges of Byzantium in the Anatolian Peninsula and against the Ottomans as well. The Ottomans could not withstand the Mongols. The only thing that prevented the Mongols from taking all of Europe was that the great Khan had died, and they all had to travel all the way back for his funeral. And when they got back there, they decided, it's too far to go. We're not going to take all the troops out there again. We're just not going. So the Mongolian Empire the empire of the Khan began to wane because they wouldn't take care of it. And so in the meantime, the Ottomans began to rise. And as the Ottomans began to rise, which this happened about in the 1200s, the Ottomans began to push at the gates of Byzantium, and they would be pushing and eating away the Byzantine Empire, primarily in the Levant. Remember that Muhammad started in Saudi Arabia, right? Mecca and Medina.
Right.
And so the Ottomans would rise. They would take Jerusalem. And this caused the Crusades, where Europeans would come back there and try to take Jerusalem back from the Ottomans. The Ottomans would take it back from the Crusaders. Crusaders would take it back. But ultimately, it came down to a confrontation between the Ottomans and what was left of Constantinople, which was really all that was left of the Byzantine Empire in 1453. And Constantinople was a very defensible city. They proved it.
Right.
And so the last king of Constantinople, of the Byzantine Empire, he had a daughter, and her name was Zoe Paleolog. Zoe Paleolog. And when the empire fell in 1453, and the only thing protecting it was an Italian mercenary who was an absolutely brilliant tactician, and he was really handing it to the Ottomans. But then there came a day when there was a huge volcanic explosion in Indonesia, and it had covered the earth with ash. And so the people in Constantinople woke up to this reddish purplish sky, and it was a weird, they were seeing a weird sky and a weird heaven. Anyway, it freaked them out. And in that day, they capitulated to the Ottomans, and the Ottomans took Constantinople. Well, Zoe Paleolog was sent off to Rome. And in Rome, the Latins had told her, look, we want to rein in these rogue these Byzantines that are up there in Mother Russia.
Mm-hmm.
So they sent Zoe Paleolog into Moscow. Actually, it wasn't Moscow at the time. It was the city of Vladimir, is what it was called. And Vladimir was the capital. This is where a wooden Kremlin had been built. And we want you to go marry Ivan III and convert him to Roman Catholicism. Well, she got there, and the Russians were like, what's that Roman cross doing here? We're not going to tolerate it. Get it out of here. And Ivan III told her, oh, you're going to come here and be my wife? Okay, you can be my wife. Learn to speak Russian and convert to Orthodoxy. And her having a background in Orthodoxy, being a Byzantine princess, it was like, done. And so she becomes the wife of the Tsar, the Tsarina, and she converts to Orthodoxy. And this would tie the Byzantine Empire directly into the Russian Empire. So the Russians then claimed, the Tsars began to claim, we are the true heirs of Byzantium. We are the true heirs of Byzantium. So now, before we get too far into this story, let's go back and let's take a look at this foundation of what would take place in Russia. Because remember that there are many indigenous peoples living in Asia, all the way from the Alaskan coast, all the way across, what they call the Russian Far East, into the central Russia, which they call the Sibir or Siberia. That's central Russia, not the Russian Far East. The Russian Far East is different than Siberia. Siberia is the mid part of Russia. Okay, so you see Magadan over here, Yakutsk, Magadan, Khabarovsk, right?
Right. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and so these from about Yakutsk over, that's actually the Russian Far East. The center part here, going all the way to the Urals, is Siberia.
Okay.
Siberia. Okay, and this is dominated by what they call the taiga. And the taiga is this vast, huge, massive forest. How big is the forest? About 4 times as big as the continental United States.
Wow.
That's how
Wow.
big the taiga is. Yeah, it's huge. Okay. So you have all these indigenous people that are living there. Many of them are reindeer people. They're people that are Laplanders. They're nomadic. They're, all these indigenous tribes who have learned to live in 90 below zero weather.
Right.
Right. And so these are these peoples. And so you have, and then there are people groups that were taken out of the northern kingdom of Israel, the 10 tribes.
Right.
Some of these tribes were taken up into the southern underbelly. So, for instance, go ahead.
I want to show you one thing that I saw on that, Dr. Pigeon, just to this is what came up in my research here. So, I was showing you this thing out of Daniel, right? The verse that we read in the beginning out of Daniel with the bear. So I wanted to look up bear, and figure out a little bit about that. And this is what I saw. And the Hebrew word for bear is dab, just the dalet bet, right? And then we've got so I take it to the primitive root, which is just how I study, and it just ends up with a dalet bet bet. So the Brown Driver Driggs was talking about how this is just to move slowly, right? And then the etymology was like it was talking about a chattering. Well, my etymology book gives the gradation variants for words that have a similar meaning in the same Hebrew family, right? And so it gave this gradation variant, which I found in Deuteronomy, a blessing for a tribe, which happens to be the tribe of Asher.
Yeah, very interesting.
I thought it was very interesting because when we look at Asher, and of Asher, he said, let Asher be blessed with children. Let him be acceptable to his brethren. Let him dip his foot in oil. Your shoes shall be iron and brass, and as your days, so shall your strength be. And strength is that gradation variant word, dab, with the dalet, the bet, and then the aleph.
The strength of the bear.
Right. A quiet strength is what we're seeing. And I thought that was very interesting that there may be a connection there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is. I mean, it's very good. There's a very good chance because Asher, of course, was, Asher on one hand were port managers, right? They were port managers and they managed Tyre, Sidon. They would come to manage Athens. They would come to manage Venice. They would come to manage Barcelona. Wow. And these people, and it's very interesting because the Venetians are a distinct group of people from the Italians. The Venetian language is distinct. And when you get to Barcelona, the Catalans are distinct from the Spanish or the Portuguese. Their language is distinct and they're a distinct people, right? And so, but Asher was also taken by the Assyrians to the east. Asher, Manasseh, Gad, Reuben. Now, Reuben was taken due east, and that family really formed under what the son called Carmi. And he formed a town called Carmani that Josephus would refer to as Germany. Germany. And so the Germans, for the most part, the nation of Germany, which wanted to trace its Aryan roots, would trace it back to Carmani. And this is why they came back to the Iranians and said they're the Persians and said, you guys are Aryans. And so Persia renamed itself Iran, which is Farsi for Aryan, Iran, right? And so, but Manasseh would kind of form up as Massagete. And it was very interesting because the Massagete would be wearing cones for hats, right? And they try to call them cone heads or whatever. But the Massagete were up in, and they were ferocious fighters. That's why Manasseh was placed where it was, to be the bulwark fighters, because they beat Og of Bashan by themselves. The Massagete, the Manasseh. And so Manasseh would be up in Afghanistan and would also be the tribe that would move up. Now, of course, the Turks have since, the Turkish tribes have moved into that area, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and so forth. They speak a Turkish language. But the Afghanis, on the other hand, are Massageti, or the tribe of Manasseh, and they would defeat Alexander the Great. They killed Alexander the Great. right? They killed Alexander the Great. They chased Russia out of Afghanistan, and they chased America out of Afghanistan.
Wow.
I got to tell you, man, I performed a marriage between a Russian gal and an Afghani. And the Afghan guys, after the marriage was done, at the reception, they all got up and started dancing. I'm telling you, you haven't seen men dancing until you see Afghan men doing it. It's just unbelievable. Anyway, pretty incredible. But as we,
it's powerful when men do that and let loose. And I mean, I've been in some worship conferences, and it's when the men decide to get up and really praise. That's where I mean, the power that comes through with that, it's amazing.
it's so true. It's so true, Shell. It's so true. So anyway, so when we talk about this, so you have these groups of people, right? So you've got these tribes that are up here to the east of the Caspian Sea. You have the indigenous tribes that are peppered along Siberia and the Russian Far East. And then you have this group of people that are really probably the House of Asher, but also maybe the House of Medea, the Medes that were also up in this area, the House of Gimer that was up in this area, or Gomer, right? And these houses were also present. But the Nordic houses, which would primarily the House of Dan, would be coming down from a town called Novgorod, and they would be meeting with the Kievan Rus in Kiev. And there was a pathway of transit that went from Novgorod to Odessa. And this is where the Vikings would meet these southern tribes, the Kievan Rus, and they would form a singular culture, the Kievan Rus, right?
Is this what this is just a flag that I had found of that area.
Yeah, there you go. Novgorod and Rus. Now, Shell, can you excuse me for just a minute and let me come back?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I'll be right back. Okay.
No problem. So while Dr. Pidgeon's on a quick break, I'll just kind of go through some of what I had seen. Here, let me go back. So we started with this one, and we were looking here. This is just kind of a timeline that I had seen and found to kind of look at, what timeline, what type of who was in play. And so this is where Dr. Pidgeon was just talking. I see it kind of lying in the timeline between Muscovite Russia from 1283 to 1547, and then this kingdom of Russia, which would have been centered in Lviv, which is 1199 to 1349. So I had seen that. It's really interesting because Dr. Pidgeon was taking us all the way back, like to the Norse people, the Nordic people, which he was seeing as the tribe of Dan. So I just found that really, really interesting. I can't wait to hear what all he has to share with us about that. And then I'll just go through, like, currently we've got the current flag of Russia, which was adopted on August 22nd, 1992. And then this was the flag that we were just talking about with the Novgorod Republic, the Novgorodian Rus Republic. And I had another slide in here too. These are some other ones that I found right here. Let me go back and get Dr. Pidgeon back on. There we are. I was just going through some of the little bit of research that I had, things that I had found, different flags, got, the crest, different things of that nature, to kind of show. One thing that I'd seen, we had just kind of basically talked about this, was America's tendency to kind of make fun of, like, so this was an old cover of a humor magazine called Puck that was put out on January 20th of 1904. And the cartoon was meant to imply that Russia was big, brutal, and clumsy. And we Americans, of course, are just great.
Yeah, cat's me out, right?
Right.
Well, I can tell you, when you look at the heart of the Russian, and I'll give you an example. Of course, my experience with Russia has to do with living here in Alaska, right? And so this was a place pioneered by the Russians. Now you have to remember, you've got to try to remember, Shell, this place is difficult. Okay, it's difficult. It's a very difficult place to live. If you don't know what you're doing, you're dead. It's that simple. And so when this place was initially pioneered, it was pioneered by a guy named Vitus Bering. So let's talk about the toughness of Vitus Bering. Before there was ever a railroad that crossed Russia, the railroad was built in the 1880s by a German named Sergei Vitae. And he built the train from Moscow to Vladivostok. It was a single rail. It was pretty primitive, but it opened up the whole of the country by train. Before then, you basically had to work your way across a country that, now you're talking, from New York to LA is 3,000 miles. From Moscow to Vladivostok is 7,500 miles.
Wow.
Okay, this is a 12-hour flight from Moscow, right? And so this gives you an idea of how vast this was. Well, Vitus Bering took a team and they walked from Moscow all the way to Vladivostok. When they got to Vladivostok, they built a ship. Then they took that ship and they went sailing into an unknown region in the Arctic to discover what is now called the Bering Sea. It was named after Vitus Bering.
Right.
They sailed up and they found the coast and they came around all this area and they realized, hey, look, this place is pretty cool. So Vitus Bering claims Alaska for Russia. And so when Russia started to come into Alaska this is about the 1630s, the first one to show up is a Russian Orthodox priest named Joseph. And he comes to a place way out in the Aleutian chain we now call Unalaska. It's also known across the bay as Dutch Harbor. And this is an opening in the Aleutian chain that opens up into what we call Bristol Bay, which is a big fishing area. And he forms a church there. And from that church, in a rowboat, he would row across Bristol Bay over to visit the villagers that were living on the peninsula, the southwestern Alaska. He would row over there on this boat. And this was how he founded the initial church. So when you want to talk about toughness of spirit, you could think about what was involved in doing all that. Right. And so then the Russians would ultimately, they would pioneer, Vladivostok would become a larger and larger center. And the Russians would be coming out. And so when they came into Alaska, there was only one battle between the Russians and the Aleuts, which took place off Kodiak Island. And it wasn't much of a battle. The Russians won the battle. I think there was 120 something Aleuts that died in the battle. And then Russia claimed conquest over Alaska, like they ever set foot in Fairbanks. They never did, right? But they claimed ownership over the coast, and they came up Cook Inlet, well past Anchorage, up into Oklahoma and so forth. So the city that's kind of near me is Wasilla. Well, Wasilla, people have heard of Wasilla. That's such a stupid name. They don't recognize that is the Russian name Vasily, which means king, of course, Vasily, right? And so this place is named Vasily. And then, of course, you have other towns that are like Ninilchik, which is a Russian name. There are so many villages along Cook Inlet that are named after the Russians. There are Russian churches that were put in Kodiak, in Ninilchik, in Kenai, in Eklutna, Russian churches that have been established here forever. And the Aleuts themselves took Russian last names and were converted to Russian Orthodoxy. So you can go to graveyards in Eklutna or in Anchorage or in Kenai, whatever, and you will find many Orthodox crosses, right? That's the 3-cross Orthodox cross. You know what I'm talking about? And right. That 3-tiered cross, so you understand what that is. The Orthodox cross has the little cross at the top is for the nameplate where the name was placed. Then you have the pedicellum stauros, and then you have the place where the feet were, and that's why it's at an angle, because the feet were at an angle in the Orthodox thinking. And so this is where that cross comes from. And but anyway, the Russians would go so far, they would go down the California coast. There is a Russian fort at a place called Point Arena in Mendocino County. And that fort, by the way, is still there. But they had established a presence all the way down to California. And however, they weren't particularly interested in that southern area because they were interested primarily in harvesting furs.
Mm-hmm.
And the big fur harvest for them was in southeastern Alaska, where they could harvest otter, which was the most expensive fur. And so the real impetus for Russians to grab Alaska wasn't necessarily for the fishing, but rather for the fur trade. They wanted to control the fur trade, seals, otters, etc. And so they did. And so Alexander Baranov, the capital was originally in Kodiak, and he pulled the capital out and said, no, Kodiak's too rough. And if you've ever been to Kodiak, you know what his thinking is. And he pulled out of Kodiak and he put the capital in Sitka. Now, if you go to Sitka today, the very center of the city in Sitka is a Russian Orthodox church. That's the very center of the city is a Russian Orthodox church. And the archdiocese of the Russian Orthodox Church is a block up from there. And they control 53 dioceses in the state of Alaska right now.
Wow.
So the way Russia would do it is you'd have a pioneer come out, the pioneer would look, and then that would be followed by an Orthodox priest who would go out and establish some ridiculous monastery, some ridiculous church in some ridiculous place where no man could ever live, and they'd live, and they'd pull it off. They'd do it, you know. And so when you see this kind of culture, so what takes place is after the Kievan Rus are beginning to thrive, and this history begins in Kiev, there was another group. They were always suffering under the Mongols out of Astrakhan.
Mm-hmm.
It's another group that formed up far enough north where the Mongols couldn't get to them. They began to use the fourth rank of their military called the Russian Winter.
Right.
Russian Winter, which has its own army. And so they began to use this up in this city called Vladimir. And Vladimir is about 90 miles north of Moscow.
Right.
And so they built quite a beautiful Kremlin there and so forth. But in the 1400s, it would be in the 1400s that Moscow would be formed on the Moscow River. And Moscow was formed on two rivers. There was Moscow River running through, and then there was another river that ran this way. And right at the triangle of that river, of those two rivers, they would build the Kremlin. So they had a natural river on this side and the Moscow River on this side as two natural fortresses, or moats, if you will, to support the fortress. And then the main wall here. And then south of that main wall was the trading area. And this is where they used to put up the flea markets, if you want to call them that. You know, the tent markets, that kind of thing. And this is where all the trade took place. And that became Krasnaya Ploshad, which we interpret as Red Square. But Krasnaya also means beautiful, right? The beautiful plaza, because it's not red and it's not square. Okay. But then interestingly enough, south of this plaza, this red square, was Chinatown. It was Chinatown. And they call it Kitay Garod. And so this was Chinatown. So the leadership in Moscow at this time was very much Oriental, if you will. They were the dress was very Chinese influenced, Mongol influenced, Oriental influenced, even though they were Caucasian peoples. If you go back and you look at the old dress of the czars, they were wearing Oriental style dress and fur hats and so forth. Wow. And so this would be the case until you get to the rise of the Romanovs. And the Romanovs would happen under Ivan III, Ivan II, Ivan I. And these czars would, the first thing that happened was Ivan III defeated the Mongols at Astrakhan. That was a very large issue. And so by doing that, they created sovereignty of the Kievan Rus all the way from Novgorod to Odessa, and then all the way to the Caspian Sea. This was all Russia. And then the czars from that point forward would then push back against the Mongols, and they would push back in other terrain to push out the empire. Now, when you look at Siberia and you say, how come China didn't take Siberia? Because China didn't want Siberia. That's why they didn't take Siberia, because they don't want to live in that cold country. They don't know how to live in that cold country. and they don't want to live in that cold country. So why
Right.
does Russia dominate the Arctic? Because they know how to live there. That's why.
Yeah.
And so this is really, so you got to understand that about Russia too.
Can I ask you a question about that? Now, we see certain places a lot of megalithic architecture. Does that come into play in Russia?
Well, this is a fantastic question, and this is a question that is going to be very difficult to deal with. But because I can get very far astray here very quickly. But the discussion of Tartaria, right?
Right.
Tartaria, and the question of Tartaria, was Tartaria a major civilization to the east of the Ural Mountains? Now, it's very possible that this was the case, particularly in light of what we're learning now, which is that there may have been a pole shift. In fact, pole shifting may be going on the Earth all the time. It may be a constant feature of the Earth that we just haven't recognized. But if the pole was substantially different, let's say the North Pole was somewhere in India or at the Himalayas, right? This is going to change everything. It's going to change how the oceans is. It's going to change the bulge of the Earth. It's going to change the tidal flows. It's going to change everything. Now, we see evidence of this. This is a very interesting thing that BP Earthwatch brought out the other day. He said if you measure sea level at the equator, it's 400 feet higher than it is at the North Pole. The water depth is 400 feet higher. So now you go and you look at some of the evidence of what we find in the Bahamas, where you see evidence of cities, right? Large stones and highways and everything else underwater. Well, the Bahamas is not very deep, less than 100 feet deep. That area was at one time high and dry, and it was known as India.
Wow.
It was known as India. So Columbus wasn't like out of his gourd thinking, I'm going to go to New Delhi. He was looking for that place, right?
Right.
But it had been flooded. And we see evidence of this off the coast of Japan as well, that there appear to be megalithic structures that are now underwater. So Graham Hancock reasons that, in fact, Indonesia was a subcontinent, and that it was connected all the way to Australia, which is how all these animals got back and forth. They didn't get it. They didn't go over there by boat. A kangaroo didn't swim over there. And so one time this was a subcontinent connected to Asia. Similarly, we can see that there were different places that were deeper and different places that were more shallow. The North Sea, for instance. I was speaking with an Welsh historian on the island of Anglesey at one of the museums, Ian Jones, brilliant guy. And we got to talking, and the next thing you know, we're talking about Doggerland. And Doggerland is, of course, the North Sea was at one time dry. That was an agricultural area full of farmers. They know that they found evidence of grapevines in northern Scotland. That when they dug up London to build the towers at the City of London, they found saber-toothed tigers, hippopotamus in London, right? It gives you an idea that the climate was substantially different, and probably because the pole was somewhere else. And it created an entirely different environment, a disproportionate displacement of water on the Earth, and some places showing shallow now or being above water, and other places being underwater.
Yeah. I mean, this is what's fascinated me about this is I was looking at the Black Sea, when the war broke out between Ukraine and Russia, and I'm looking at the Black Sea, I'm looking at Crimea and the city of Kerch, and looking at what, like, the history of that as definitely a very paganistic, PowerPoint of worship, a powerful center. And what I noticed was in the Black Sea, it's only salinated on the top part, but not on the bottom part. And
That's
so
correct.
yeah, things have been extremely preserved. And so I'm always looking at, we're watching, what, the human drama play out, but there's a drama going on in the heavenlies far above our knowledge, And so if that's one of those ancient PowerPoints, portal type places, if you will.
Oh, I think it is. I mean, when you look at Crimea, okay, there is, when you look at the Crimean Peninsula, there is a sea to the east of the Crimean Peninsula called the Azov Sea or Azov Sea. And this sea, Rostov na Donu, the Don River comes down into that sea, and Rostov is the Russian city at one end of it. But when it crosses through Crimea, the Russians have built a bridge to connect this now. Russia, Krasnodar to Crimea. It's called the Kerch Strait Bridge over the Kerch Strait. Well, right there where that bridge crosses, there is an ancient city that is underwater. Massive ancient city that is underwater. Also in Crimea, they found the evidence of 5 pyramids, all 5 which, by the way, are emitting frequencies right now, right? And so Crimea, and then the Black Sea, as you mentioned, the lower half of the Black Sea is fresh water, and the upper half is salt water. And this has to do with the Bosporus Canal, which connects the Aegean to the Black Sea. And this used to be called the River Sabaton, and it was called the River Sabaton because it used to flow eastward for 6 days, and then stop, and then flow westward for 6 days, and then stop. And this went on until the canal was finally broken down and the salt water came into the Black Sea. But it was insufficient to displace the fresh water on the bottom. So the Black Sea, I've actually swam in the Black Sea, and it is, the Black Sea is really, it's a very different place, the Black Sea, very different place. And, in the nation.
What do you mean by that? Like, I mean, are you sensing something completely different when you're in that water?
Well, it's just, to give you an example, there's no beaches there. It's gravel, not sand,
right.
Gravel.
Right.
It's very, very shallow. And it has, so you can walk out, like when we were at Batumi, Georgia, you can walk out, to 150 feet and you're maybe waist deep in water.
Wow.
Right. Yeah. So it's a very, shallow plain like this that goes into this lake, into the sea, but the water can be incredibly rough.
Huh.
It will sink ships, it's like some of the water in Lake Superior and this kind of thing, right? You get that same kind of storms inside the Black Sea.
Which means there's we're probably talking about some major principalities, because I always think about that when Yeshua walked upon the water, he was putting Yam Soph in its place, showing.
Yeah. Very good, Shell. Very good. Yeah. And this is the thing, that we, so this is why, we talk about the Black Sea, the Caspian Sea, which is really landlocked. The Caspian Sea is landlocked. It's really a lake, but they call it the Caspian Sea. And, so this area is very, very different. And the word Ukraine means frontier. So when you talk about Ukraine, for Russia, that was the frontier. We call that the frontier, but in Russian, Ukraine. And so it was not a nation. It was not a nation until the Soviet Union was formed. And it was created as a distinct district, a distinct place under Nikita Khrushchev. So now when we look at this now, so let's take a look at, you can get some idea about the ethnicity that rolls around in Russia. Okay. So many Russians have a last name which begins with, or that ends with IN. Bodanin, Lisitsyn, Pushkin, right? These are names that end with IN. That's a very common Russian last name. Now, when you get into some of the outer reaches of Russian, like Central Russian and so on, this is where you get the OF, right? Rachmaninov, Budanov, these kind of things, and you'll see it often expressed in an OV or OFF, right? In terms of how it's spelled. Then you get up to St. Petersburg, and in St. Petersburg, you had many people that came in from what used to be Prussia. And so you see the SKY ending, Tchaikovsky, Mussorgsky, and so on. You see the SKY ending, which is kind of clustered around Sankt Peterburg. And Sankt Peterburg was the capital created by Peter the Great. 60,000 men lost their lives building that city,
Wow.
digging the canals in a swamp, right? It was a horrible place to build a city, but uh, Peter wanted a city that rivaled Amsterdam. And so they built the city. And today, St. Petersburg is such a beautiful city. I mean, I love St. Petersburg. I just love the place. It's so beautiful. It has a horrible history under the Soviets because they just brutally murdered people up there by the tens of thousands. And then there were some 5 million people that lost their life there during the siege of St. Petersburg under the Nazis. And
Right.
so there's a lot of blood associated with that city.
Hmm.
But nonetheless, the Nevsky River and the Nevsky Prospect and the island of the Fortress of Peter and Paul, St. Isaac's Cathedral, the Kazan Cathedral, right off the Nevsky Prospect, the Church on Spilled Blood, the site where Alexander III was assassinated, the Rimsky-Korsakov Conservatory there in the place, and of course Dostoevsky's house is there, and on and on and on and on. So it really is quite something else. St. Petersburg, it's a museum kind of a place, but right now it's a college town, big international college town. It's a beautiful place, beautiful city. About 5.5 million people living there, and there's a high-speed train that runs from St. Petersburg to Moscow. Now, it does 200 kilometers an hour. I've been on that train. It's quite nice, very modern, very beautiful. Not like some of the other trains you might catch in Russia, which are still modern compared to some of the trains you'll catch in Georgia. I mean, very. But anyway, but so when we look at these people groups, okay, so now when you look at, for instance, people that come from Belarus, right? You'll see the last name Czech, C-I-K, Czech, pronounced Czech. And so this gives you an idea that they're from Belarus. And when you see people from Ukraine, there's two last names. There's Chuk, not Czech, but Chuk, and Ko, but it's actually pronounced Ka. So, for instance, Yulia Tymoshenko, who's now been declared a terrorist by the Russian Federation, Lukashenko. These are Ukrainian last names, and the O is pronounced as an A. Okay, and so you can kind of tell who's from Ukraine, who's from Belarus, who's from St. Petersburg, who's from Russia, who's from Central Russia, right?
Right.
And by these kind of names. Now, Russia also deals with what's called the patronym. And so the patronym is that the father's name is then going to come to the daughter or the son. So if you have the father's name is Ivan and the daughter's name is Yulia, she's Yulia Ivanova or Ivanovna, right?
Okay.
It would be Anna Dmitrievna, right? And so you would have these kinds of, this patronym is the patronym for the daughter, and then the daughter takes the father's name as a patronym with a feminine ending, and whereas the son will take the patronym of the father with a masculine ending. So, for instance, Vladimir Putin, his name is Vladimir Vladimirovich because his father was also a Vladimir. But if his father's name was Sergei, then it would be Vladimir Sergeyevich. My friend Yuri, his father's name is Mikhail, so he was Yuri Mikhailovich. Yuri Mikhailovich. And so the patronym is used very rarely, and you use the patronym only when you're speaking to a person with respect. So if you're speaking to a person with respect, you almost never call them by their last name. You call them by their first name, and even a nickname. For instance, Nikolai in Russian, the nickname is Kolya, right? Alexander can be either Sasha or Sanya. But Sanya also means sleepy, so you have to be careful about that, But and Mikhail is Mishka. Dmitry is Dima. But so is Vladimir is also Dima, right? So Dmitry Medvedev would be Dima. And I don't know what Dmitry Medvedev's father is, but it might be Dmitry. So he would be Dmitry Dmitrievich, right?
Okay.
So, and and if you were referring to him, you'd refer to him by his name and his patronym. If you were referring to him with respect, you would refer
Right.
to him by his name and his patronym. You wouldn't use his last name. You wouldn't use his last name.
Yeah, totally opposite from our culture. If you're trying to show someone respect, you're using the last name.
Yeah, yeah. And you would almost never refer to anybody as Mr. and Mrs., right?
Hmm.
Gospoda or Gaspaja or Gospodia. You just wouldn't use that because it really means Lord and Lady, right? And so it's just, since the collapse of the nobility in Russia, they don't use that anymore. Instead, they use the comrade, tavarish, comrade, right? Tavarish. And so, at any rate, the idea is that this kind of culture is a bit different. Now, of course, the center mark of the Russian culture is, of course, the samovar, right? It's the samovar. And the samovar is just nothing more than a pot for boiling water from which you can make tea, right?
Right.
But when you understand the Russian culture, there's two things going on. First of all, you have this idea of the Russian language going out throughout all of Russia, but there are 165 languages spoken in Russia.
Wow.
Yeah, they're all indigenous languages and native languages and indigenous languages and languages of other tribes and tongues and so on. All these languages are spoke. And this is why the Russian government said, okay, well, you can speak whatever language you want, but you also have to speak Russian.
Right.
And if you want to move ahead in the Russian culture, you have to pass a Russian language exam to do so. So if you want to speak Ukrainian, which is kind of a form of Russian, if you want to speak Ukrainian, it's a Slavic form. You can speak Ukrainian, but if you want to work in the government, you have to pass a Russian language exam. If you want to speak Yupik, you can speak Yupik, but you have to pass a Russian exam to work in the Russian government. So this was kind of the requirement. Now, we have a similar situation in Alaska, right? My daughter teaches in the Anchorage School District. And in her school district, there are 65 languages spoken. So we have a very similar disposition to Russia in terms of handling this diversification. And is vodka really a big thing in Russia? You cannot imagine. You just cannot imagine. Now, the Russians have a little trick that they don't tell Americans. But they eat this like whale fat or something. I don't know if it's whale fat or what it is, but it's something. But they eat this whale fat or whatever it is, and it lines the whole esophagus and the stomach lining.
Okay.
And then they challenge you to a drink off, right? And that Russian vodka is about 10 to 20% stronger than American vodka.
Mm.
And it is the real thing. And the Russians, I mean, it's just not uncommon. Here we are missionaries. We're sitting at the restaurant at the Gastinicha. What was that place called? I got to remember that. The Nightingale. Anyway, we're sitting at the restaurant, and 3 Russians come in for lunch. Okay, and so for lunch they order a liter of vodka, and the bottle of vodka is brought out. They take the cap off, throw that away, because the bottle is going to be empty by the time they're done with lunch. And that's what they had for lunch, a liter of vodka between the 3 of them,
Woo.
And with that being said, okay, yeah, there's a lot of drinking that goes on in Russia, and a lot of people who die from alcoholism in Russia, no question. But you have to keep in mind, if you get caught drunk driving in Russia, Lord help you.
Wow.
Yeah, because you will lose your driver's license for life on the first offense. For life.
Wow, on the first offense.
On the first offense, you lose your driver's license for life. However, a friend of mine who was in Vladivostok, he lived in Vladivostok, I think, for 2 years. He goes over to a friend's house, and they're just getting polluted. And so he's driving down the road, and the militia, what they call the police, they just flag you like this. They take their arm, they got a little baton, and they flag you. You pull over, and it's no probable cause or nothing else. I'm just pulling you over, and you pay me a fine for whatever the reason may be. right? If they catch you drunk, it's a problem. Well, this guy's just hammered, right? So he just drives right by the policeman. And he goes a half block down the street, makes a left, gets out of the car, and screams back at the policeman, "Good day, benzene. Where can I find gas?" And all of them point. They all pointed right over there. So the necessity of getting gas in your car is going to outweigh any police stop, right? So anyway, he managed to pull that one off. But the thing is that and there's another joke about the police in Russia, right? This policeman pulls this guy over, and he says, and the guy looks at him and says, "Why did you pull me over? I didn't do anything." "Oh yeah, you did." He said, "No, I didn't do anything. You can't pull me over. I didn't do anything." He said, "Look, it's Friday night. I've got a wife and kids at home. The fine is $20. You figure out what you did." Right? And people will tell you in Russian that this is the case, right? This is the case for the militia. But you have one culture. So you have indigenous culture where people live in tribes and they do other things. And then you have, of course, Russian culture, which is dominant throughout the country, and the Russian language. Then you have Moscow and St. Petersburg. And these are two different cultures. And they're different from Russian culture. So when you get to Moscow, you can come in from someplace, maybe you're Ekaterinburg, or maybe you're coming in from Nalchik, or maybe you're coming in from Volgograd, or maybe you're coming in from Novosibirsk or Arkhangelsk, or maybe you're coming in from Omsk, or you're coming in from Vladivostok or something. You come into Moscow and you start speaking to them in Russian. "What are you talking about? I'm speaking Russian to you." That isn't how we say it in Moscow.
Wow.
In Moscow, we say it this way. So Moscow has an entirely, completely different culture that is an international culture. So my interpreter, Dima, he tells me, he says, I said, "What's the difference between Moscow and St. Petersburg?" He said, "Moscow is dominated by international mafias." He said, "St. Petersburg, it's only local mafias." And, and of course, the whole mafia scene and the oligarch scene has settled down a lot. I mean, when I first went into Russia, it was run by oligarchs, and the oligarchs were all crooks, and they were, they had all their own hitmen, and their hitmen were ruthlessly brutal and would kill anybody and anywhere. In fact, one of the guys, when we were there was a guy killed right at the train station at the Kurskaya Vokzal, which was the train station we were taking to go to Kursk. And he was called Nikolai the Grave, as in, Sheol, the grave, right? Nikolai the Grave, because this guy had killed so many people. And I didn't even know what the count was, but he had killed many, many people. And on this particular day, somebody shot him in the back of the head at the Kurskaya Vokzal. And they said, "That's the end of Nikolai the Grave. He's done. We're done with that guy," right? And so these things were going on, and the kinds of assassinations they would do in Russia, you have big problems because you have these buildings where everybody lives, and the buildings have one staircase in. There's no fire escape. Right? There's one staircase, and you have an elevator, and half the time the elevator doesn't work, and it will only take two people. And so you've got these concrete stairs that go running up, 14 stories, and that's your only way in and out. So there's a front door. There's no back door on an apartment. There's a front door. That's it. So when you come out of your apartment, you have to come out one way, and you got to come out the front door of that building. And the assassins just wait right there, shoot you right in the head as you're coming out the building, because you got no other way out.
Wow.
And so this was really dominant when Vladimir Putin first took office in Russia. Mm-hmm. This was very common in Russia. Now, Putin has since then completely changed all of this tenure. He's completely changed all of this. This is all changed dramatically. And so you see that Moscow, although when I was in Moscow in 2016, my taxi cab driver was basically threatening me, because, I called this taxi at midnight, and I told him we have to go to Domovo, Меня нужно до Домодедово, аэропорту. So he says, "Oh yeah, I'll take you there." He says, "But you need to understand." So we get on the road, and it was a 45-minute drive to the airport. It's like, Moscow's a pretty dangerous city. A guy could get hurt, particularly two Americans who don't know any Russians and blah, 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 blah. You could just be dumped right here in the woods, you know. So I looked at the guy. He says, "What are you doing in Russia?" I said, "We came here to christen the church." He said, "Are you Masons?" That was the first thing he asked me. "Are you Masons?" No, we're not Masons. "Are you Jehovah's Witnesses?" "No, we're not Jehovah's Witnesses." "Oh, okay." So then we started talking. So I ended up in a long conversation with this guy. And he's telling me, of course, the typical Russian story, which is that he's divorced.
Right.
Never gets to see his kids. And that's that. And so I said, "Look, you cannot just abandon your kids like that. You're their father. You can't just abandon. You can't just say, I don't want to see my kids anymore because I don't like my wife anymore. You need to maintain a relationship with your children." And so we had this long drive. And at the end of the drive, I ended up taking 20 minutes to pray for this guy.
Wow.
To pray for him and his family, right? Yeah. Which he was very thankful to have happened, right? And, so when you see these kinds of things, so the divorce rate in Moscow is something like 85%. The average Russian woman has 8 abortions over a lifetime. They think nothing about abortion at all. And they didn't anyway. Now, this is something that I've addressed with Putin. And I've actually had Vladimir Putin's ear surreptitiously, not directly, but I've had his ear on many things and talking about a lot of things. And, and I'm going to say to Vladimir Putin, look, there's lots of choices he could have made. But the choice he made in 2004 to take Russia back into orthodoxy was an extremely significant move. And this is something, but it's not just Putin's hand. It is the hand of Yah that has moved Russia out of an atheist nation back into orthodoxy. I mean, you could not believe when we first came to Russia, I'd have people tell me, "Oh, look, I really want you to teach the Bible to my children, but forget about me. I'm lost cause. I've been an atheist my whole life. I've had atheism pounded into my head by the Soviets, and I'm not going to change. End of story. But you're welcome to tell my children, right?" But you could see. I mean, to give you an example, so when we want to understand Russia. You cannot understand Russians. You cannot understand them unless you recognize what happened to them during the rise of the Bolsheviks. Okay? You cannot understand it until you understand what happened to them under the Bolsheviks. Now, this thing that happened to them under the Bolsheviks, it was obviously the hand of Yah because it lasted from 1921 to 1991. It was a 70-year famine of the word, and Yah removing his hand off Russia entirely and saying, "I'm going to let you have this now." This was judgment that came on Russia. The Bolsheviks were judgment that came on Russia. You cannot underestimate this. Now, why this happened, I don't know. I suspect that there was a huge falling away into wickedness that it's the record is not sufficient enough, at least not in the English language, that I can tell you that under Nicholas I and Alexander II and Alexander III, that there was a wickedness that took place. But I can say this, that, you had Catherine the Great, right, who was a German. And she was maybe the Hillary Clinton of her day. Ooh. Okay. She had her own wickedness that is well known in the Eastern world.
Didn't it include bestiality?
Yes, it did. In fact, that's how she died.
Wow.
Yeah, the story is that the I'll try to be as subtle as I can be. The leather straps holding the horse broke and crushed her.
And crushed her. Wow.
And
wow.
So anyway, this is the story. But Catherine the Great suppressed at the point of the sword the peasant uprisings. So there was not slavery, but serfdom. And serfdom was, of course, practiced throughout Europe too. It's practiced right now. Nobody wants to call it serfdom, but it is. You don't own the land, and basically you're a tenant farmer to the nobleman who owns all the land. And the nobleman would take everything they had. They would take 80%. You grow a garden, the nobleman comes in and takes 80% of it. It says, "You're lucky I don't take all of it," right? And so there were peasant uprisings that took place under Catherine the Great, which she crushed at the point of a sword. Now, maybe this is what invoked judgment, but it's very interesting because she had a son whose name was Pavel. He's the only czar who had the name Pavel, Pavel the First. And before she died, a painter painted this icon for her. And this icon was prophetic. I think it was painted in 1709, and it's a prophetic icon. Very important icon. Almost very few Americans know anything about this icon. But this icon predicted in this icon that her son would reign for 4 years, 4 months, and 4 days. That was the prophecy in the icon. And that's exactly how long he did reign. And he was assassinated by the von der Palen family. You know, you've heard of Sarah Palin? Well, the von der Palen family was the family that was responsible for the assassination of Pavel the First. And Pavel the First had a very interesting tenure. In that 4 years, he enacted a law that said the firstborn, whether it be male or female, is the rightful czar or czarina of Russia. The firstborn, whether it be male or female. This was Pavel the First who enacted this rule because, of course, he had a very powerful mother, Catherine the Great. Well, after that, after the death of Pavel the First, who was assassinated, now we see something that's beginning to happen, which is going to include a series of peasant revolts that are going to be suppressed by the Tsar. Okay, this goes on and on and on and on. So I think that Yah was essentially saying, look, you guys are in error. You can't sit here and be an Orthodox people and be doing this to your own.
Right.
This may have been what brought judgment on Russia. But when judgment came in under the Bolsheviks were financed by Jewish bankers in the United States and Jewish bankers in London, namely Jacob Schiff, who was a huge Russophobe, who wanted to kill all the Russians, hated Russians with a purple passion, wanted to kill the Tsar, wanted to kill all the Russians he possibly could. And there were Russophobes in London under the Rothschild family. And I believe Dale Carnegie was also a part of this, that were actively funding these Bolsheviks. Lenin was in jail in Vienna. They got him out of jail. And his name was Ulyanov, by the way, Vladimir Ulyanov, a Russian Jew. And he met with, of course, Lev Bronstein, who would change his name to Leo Trotsky, also a Russian Jew, or atheist Jew. And they would meet up with the Georgian Jew, Yosef Jugashvili, also known as Joseph Stalin. They would all change their identity. Ulyanov would become Lenin, Bronstein would become Trotsky, and Jugashvili would become Stalin. And the leadership of the Bolsheviks was all Russian Jews, atheist Jews, being funded by atheist Jews in the United States and in London. And they were given 20 million in hard gold to wage the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
Was that from the United States?
It was from these bankers.
Right. Okay.
It was from these bankers. You have to remember these bankers. The Schiff family is one of the families that owns the Federal Reserve. This is why Adam Schiff can commit every crime he wants to commit in Congress, and he can't be displaced because he's part of that family. Anyway, so when you see what took place in St. Petersburg, they brought in all this gold, and these guys began agitating to overthrow the Tsar. And Nicholas II was a weak-minded Tsar. He wasn't particularly strong at all. He was not particularly good at administration. And when World War I broke out, which was his big error, because he put his troops into maneuvers when the Serbians, are you familiar with the story of World War I? Okay, well, Archduke the problem begins very early with Franz Joseph, the emperor of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. Franz Joseph was getting old. His son was supposed to take over as the king, as the emperor. And I'm sorry, I may be going sideways here, but let me get through this. Okay. So anyway, Franz Joseph was the emperor. His son was supposed to take over. And when his son was supposed to take over, his son killed his wife and committed suicide. It was a murder-suicide that took place outside of Vienna. So Franz Joseph was left with no heir. And so he doesn't know what he's going to do. So he's getting older and older and older. And finally, he goes to a cousin who is the Archduke Ferdinand. He says, you're enough in the bloodline to take over the throne of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. So I'm going to make you my heir to take over. So Franz Joseph is still living. And the Archduke Ferdinand is going around, basically, he's a reform agent. He's going to form a parliament. He's going to bring in democratic reforms. He's going to liberalize the serfs and so on and so forth. And he goes down on a visit into the Balkans. And when he gets down to Sarajevo in Bosnia-Herzegovina, he's shot by an agent of the Black Hand who shot both him and his wife while they were driving on a back street in Sarajevo. And so anyway, when that happened, Franz Joseph was like, what? It took me 30 years to find an heir and you just assassinated him? I'm going to go down there and stomp your brains in. And so he writes to Germany and he says, look, I want to go down there and stomp these guys. Will you back us? And Germany sends him the blank check. Do what you need to do. And so as Franz Joseph is preparing to go down and stomp the Serbs, Nicholas II puts his troops into maneuvers. If you come in and come against the Serbs, you're coming against Russia. This is going to break out. And as soon as Russia began to do that, Germany said, looks like it's war. So Germany just advanced in both directions. War is on. Let's do it. The Kaiser von Wilhelm did not want to do that war. But he felt forced because Nicholas II put his troops into motion. Well, the Russians got their heads handed to them. They didn't lose the war, but they lost millions of men because he sent them into battle with no arms. Right? Go fill the position. Right? And so Nicholas II, when he's out there running the war, so he would take off from St. Petersburg and he'd go down to the front. I'm the general. Let's go do this. Let's go do that. Because he needed to, because he was foolishly started this war. Well, while he's down at the front, guess who's hanging around with the Tsarina? Rasputin. And Rasputin, I don't know if you know the life of this guy, man. Oh, I'm telling you. Rasputin.
This is what Stephanie was saying. Maybe Rasputin had something to do with Russia's punishment.
Yeah.
Tell us more about Rasputin.
Yeah, that's very possible because Rasputin brought in a whole bunch of occult stuff and he was wicked from one end to the other. And, and the kinds of things he did. And so finally the nobility in St. Petersburg said, we're going to kill this guy. It's time for us to kill this guy. We're not going to mess around with it anymore. Invite him over to the house. Let's poison him. Wow. So they invited him over to this guy's house for a winter party. And they had enough strychnine in one biscuit to kill 5 men.
Wow.
And he ate like 5 of them. He ate like 5 of them. And it's like, how come he's not dying? He ate so much strychnine it would kill everybody in this room and he's not dying. He's not even sick. I don't know. We need to do something with him. So they took him out and they knifed him. And and he was still fighting back. So finally one guy shot him and then they pushed him into a canal. One of the canals of St. Petersburg. And he was walking his way out of it.
Wow.
And he died from exposure. He did not die from the gunshot. He did not die from the knife wound. He did not die from the strychnine. He died from exposure. And so when that happened, there was huge hatred against the Tsarina. They thought she was having an affair with this wicked monk. And the Tsar was a failure on the front in World War I. And then you got guys with $20 million in cash, in gold, agitating the whole time. So in comes the Bolshevik Revolution. Well, after the Bolshevik Revolution, there were 66 million Russian Orthodox people put to death by these Bolsheviks. There was forced starvation. There were quotas of slaughter in the cities. I need 5,000 more dead this month. Kill 5,000, kill 3,000. Khrushchev asked for the right to kill 17,000 in 1 month. And so the famine, well before it got to Ukraine, the famine was all over Russia. How bad was it? They had to post guards at the cemeteries because when somebody died, the people would dig him up that night in order to eat him.
Wow.
Mothers were killing their youngest children to feed their other kids. This is how bad it was. And so you're talking 66 million people here, Shell. 66 million people put on trains. They'd say, okay, you're going to Siberia. So they would take people and they'd shove them on an uninsulated boxcar and they'd pack them in like sardines. Everybody's standing around. You don't have room to sit down. There's so many people in the boxcar. No insulation, middle of winter, and then shipped out on a train 5, 6, 7, 8 days to Siberia. Then the door opens, get out, this is where you are.
Wow.
So millions froze to death all over the place. There was one event where Stalin took a ship and he loaded it up with 3,500 prisoners in the hull of the ship. Then they sent the ship out of Arkhangelsk, and it was going to go along the northern shore of Siberia to Magadan, which is on the Pacific coast. Well, they got caught in the ice. And every single one of those prisoners froze to death in the hull of that ship. And the horrendousness of them freezing to death and screaming and yelling caused the whole crew to commit suicide.
Wow. Wow.
Okay. So, before we start talking about, gee, who are these Russians? If you want to understand the soul of a Russian, hope, crushed again, do it again.
Wow.
Okay. That's the soul of the Russian, right? Should we hope? Don't hope. Don't hope. Don't even think about hoping. Well, I've got a little glimmer of hope. Okay, let's do it. Hope, crushed, smashed, broken, slammed down, slammed to the ground, nothing. Okay, now what? You're still living. Do you dare hope again? I think so.
Wow.
So this is the kind of situation. So when the war started between Germany and Russia, which, by the way, was caused by Stalin's shenanigans, the Ribbentrop-Molotov treaty that they claimed Hitler broke. Well, Stalin was in the process of pulling shenanigans in the back room on that deal, too. Okay. Stalin was the most bloodthirsty dog that ever lived. Okay. I spit on his grave and I spit on his statue. And anyway, and the Russians did too. When the Soviet Union fell, there was a huge red granite statue of Stalin in Red Square. They knocked that statue down and poked the eye out.
Wow.
And then they took the statue and put it over in the park of fallen statues in front of a wall of human skulls.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, when you try to understand Russia, try to understand that you had a group of people who had come out of peasantry trying to find their way into modernity in one of the most difficult climates in the world. Strong people, resilient people, trying to find their way out. And as they tried to find their way out, a bunch of bankers out of the West brought in this atheist Bolshevism, communism, which is political Talmudism is all it is. They knocked all the crosses off all of those churches in Russia, converting the major churches into movie theaters. They took the most important church in Moscow down, the Church of Christ Our Savior. They took that down to build the Palace of the Soviets. And they couldn't build it because it was swamp, so they put in a swimming pool. But the minute the Soviet Union fell, the mayor of Moscow, the very first thing he did was to rebuild Christ Our Savior Church. The very first thing he did was to rebuild that church. Now, you can say, oh, these guys drink a lot of vodka. Oh, these guys are corrupt. Oh, these guys are sinners. Oh, these guys do this, or they do that, or they do the other thing. Well, that may be the case, but to them, the Church of Christ Our Savior was the top priority. Of all things, that was the top priority, right? So,
this is what's been fascinating to me because, I grew up and one of my intros, I named it Reports from Under the Desk because I grew up, with that Cold War scare, Russia's going to bomb us. You got to get under your desk. Like that's going to keep you safe from a nuclear bomb, right? That was the drills we had in school.
Yeah, I remember that. Sure, I did those.
Ridiculous, So you grow up in this culture that Russia's this terrible place, terrible people. But then I'm watching the culture that we've had, and especially I really started paying a lot of attention in 2020. And when you see all of our military being forced to learn how to march in red high heels, and then you watch the commercials of the Russian military and what a disparity we see going on, in the cultures. And I'm looking and looking from a Christian perspective and going, their culture looks more righteous than the one I'm stuck in.
There's no question it is right now. The way it is right now, there's no question. They are a pro-family culture. They have now changed the laws concerning abortion. They now fund you to have children.
Wow.
And the funding is actually advanced. They want people who have 4 or more children is their preference. They want you to have many, many children and to grow families and to grow their demographic. So they're very pro-family, and they're very opposed to anything that is going to tear down the family, like the LGBT agenda. They see that as anti-family. They don't want any part of it. They don't want it in Russia at all. Not at all. So they've criminalized it. They even call it, if you proselytize it, that's an act of terrorism under the Russian laws. And so Russia is now a Christian theocracy under its constitution. It's a Christian theocracy.
And let me just ask you one more question. I'm going to ask this because we're on YouTube. I'm going to ask this as delicately as I know how. But we all know that the agenda that descended upon the world, and I know that Israel forced their citizens into that mainstream medical solution at about 96%.
Yeah.
What was Russia's what did they do with that? How, what was the percentage?
Russia did not allow any of the foreign manufacturers into Russia, and instead they developed their own protocol called Sputnik.
Oh.
And it was called Sputnik, and it was a really standard protocol. In other words, they understood this particular thing to be a strain of cold, right? It's a strain of a cold. And so they essentially did what would be common, which would be to isolate the particular cold, whatever it is that you're calling it, and they would isolate, and then they would integrate that into an inoculation that would be commonplace. So what we always used to do in the old stuff, you'd put a little bit in your body to cause your antibodies to react, and then this somehow, supposedly gender a protection, and that's what they did. And and even that was not a mandatory protocol. They had it available, but it was not mandatory.
So probably their entire population is not full of
correct. Of all the stuff that goes with it.
They
That's
can be manipulated, right, by certain frequencies. Yeah.
That's correct. That's correct.
What an advantage.
In terms of physical health.
Right.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And and so as a result, you can see now that the and I noticed this when I was in Russia, actually in the early 2000s, because we eat polluted food in the United States. We eat GMO stuff. We eat stuff that is single generation food. You can't grow it again because the plant doesn't produce any seed.
No seed.
And it's loaded with artificial fertilizers, and it's loaded with artificial pesticides, and then it's loaded with artificial flavoring, including fetal tissue, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so when you go to the store, you look at the stuff, you go, look at the size of that strawberry, that's beautiful, and then you eat it, and it's like it's got no flavor at all. It just tastes like kind of cardboard.
Yep.
I was like, what happened here? And and you get this over and over again throughout all the product things. So now they have to select and put separate side. Oh, here's the organic stuff, which you can pay 3 times the price for if you want it, right? But the thing is, in Russia, they don't allow GMOs. Period. They're banned by law. And this is one of the big wars that's going on in Ukraine, is that Russia is not going to allow Monsanto to plant GMO wheat in Ukraine. This is one of the big underlying things that's going on. They're not going to allow it. Not in that breadbasket.
That's amazing. It's amazing. I wish that I was living in a society that felt that way, because I feel that way. Between that and understanding all the biolabs in Ukraine, it's like, it just blows me away.
Yeah, it's really insane. Well, it's part of the filthiness of America now, that we have not taken care of these things, and we should have. We should have taken care of these things. And a lot of it has to do with runaway corporations, that we do not have to allow these golems to take off like we have, and to have the life they have, such that these corporations are controlling everything now. And the
NGOs are running our nation and making all the decisions. And I didn't elect any of them. I mean, they're not even,
Yeah. So how did they get to do that? Well, because they have the money, right? And so we're in Yah's judgment. Truth be told, Shell, these things have happened because we have fallen away, and because we have fallen away, we can't police our own selves. We can't see the more morality. I mean, I can tell you, the first time you eat German bread or Belgian bread, when you eat some of the bread that's on the continent and you taste real wheat,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, wait a minute. I mean, I'm afraid to eat bread in the States because it's nothing but pure carbs and starch, and there's no nutrient in it whatsoever. When you eat real bread, it's like, yeah, I can eat this stuff. This stuff is not a problem for my, and there's no gluten intolerance involved in
Right.
any of it because it's real wheat. It's real wheat. And so this was a big protocol in Russia. So, when I saw the children in Russia, I'm looking at these kids and it's like, these kids are unbelievably healthy.
Mm.
They're very, very healthy. Look at the complexion on their face. Look at their skin color. Look at their hair color. You can see the health in them as compared to seeing the sickly children that we have in America, right?
It's amazing when you just mentioning that. I have a lot of friends because of my association with the Wellbeing by Design Clinic in Ohio. A lot of my friends, one of the women I went to school with, I went to school at Dr. Monzo's clinic to learn how to, do some things to help us get through when we have a system we can't rely on anymore, right? So one of my friends there, she is a blood analyst, and I was just watching a post of hers where she's talking about what she's seeing is that the blood of the elderly in this country is looking better than the blood of children. And she's pinpointed it to 35 and under is looking horrible. And she's kind of associated that with the technology that's come in and all the, schedule of the inoculation schedule that's happened, on this
Yeah.
grand scale that we've done. And
It's so
destroyed
sad.
our own kids.
Yeah. We're looting our culture. We're looting
Yeah.
it, right? And so this is why we see the culture being destroyed. Now, repentance and turning back to the way would cure a lot of these ills, would cure all these ills if we ever got around to doing it. We're never going to be able to do it, Shell. It's not going to happen in this country. Judgment is here now, and it's here to stay.
That's kind of what takes me back to, this first thing that I saw, Dr. Pidgeon, this is what I'm wondering, is this where we're at, to where the lion gets the two eagles' wings clipped, and then who rises up except a bear?
Yeah, I think this is correct. And I think now the difficulty is that I don't want to put any ideas in Russia's mind, and I really don't want to terrify anybody. However, to try to talk common sense into the American leadership is impossible. It's impossible. So, Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, yesterday said that NATO pilots are going to be flying NATO F-16s out of NATO bases to strike targets in Russia. Now, Russia has made it perfectly clear. If a plane takes off out of Poland, or a plane takes off out of Romania, or out of Germany, or out of France, and flies a mission and then strikes a target in Russia, they're going to bomb that airport. They're going to bomb that runway where that plane came from. They're going to bomb that runway. Now, the question is, and this is the question that is looming large, and I'm going to talk about it tonight when I do separate moments. Actually, I'm going to talk about this tonight. I want to talk about the Albert Pike prophecy. I'm going to talk about the Dmitry Duduman prophecy, the Henry Gruver prophecy. I'm going to talk about these prophecies and the 1709 icon, and also the von Rensburg prophecies out of South Africa. All these prophecies, they all point in the same direction, that when you see what the war that's coming, the war is going to detonate first in Israel. And this war is at the very precipice. Now, Hal Turner basically laid out this scenario, and it's very brilliant on his part, which is this, that Israel has been using Cyprus as a landing base to put its aircraft in Cyprus, and then they approach Lebanon from the Mediterranean, and they launch missiles. When the missiles get into distance, so maybe they're 200 kilometers away from the target, they can launch the missile from there and then turn around and go back. So you don't even see the plane. You don't see the aircraft. All you see is the missile coming in and blowing you up. And Hezbollah told them, if you use any platforms in Cyprus, we're going to blow up the air bases in Cyprus. Well, Cyprus belongs to Greece. So if Hezbollah launches against Greece, and by the way, Mike Pompeo is deeply involved in the middle of this, if Hezbollah launches against airports in Cyprus, Greece is going to get involved and say, well, we're going to declare war on Lebanon. And if Greece declares war on Lebanon, Turkey is going to declare war on Greece. So now Turkey now enters the fray on behalf of Hezbollah and Iran and Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Saudi Arabia now, which is calling for a separate Palestinian state, and Iran. And Iran has said, when you guys go to war with Hezbollah, we're definitely going to be joining the war. Okay, so this situation is going to detonate in Israel, and it's going to detonate in the next couple of days. And this thing is just going to go kaboom, and this fire is going to immediately expand to capture all of the Middle East, including Turkey and Greece, in this battle. This is going to be joined with what's taking place between China and the Philippines right now, where war is breaking out between the two of them. That's going to happen first because China has to defeat the enemy on its flank before it can take Taiwan. They're going to defeat the Philippines, and then they're going to be looking at Taiwan. In the meantime, Vladimir Putin just flew out of North Korea, where he has told the North Koreans, I'm going to give you long-range ICBMs with nukes on them so you can hit the U.S., and he just flew out of Vietnam, where he is restoring the relationship between Vietnam and Russia. Most people don't know that Vietnam has the single largest army in the world. They have 58 million men under arms in Vietnam. Okay? So this is the kind of thing that's ballooning. So structurally, the United States has already lost this war. We shouldn't be entertaining it at all. We've already lost it. But there is nobody listening. And if there were people listening, we should have recognized in 1990 that our natural best friend was Russia. Christian nation, full of resources. We had the technology, they had the resources. We should have joined together then instead of giving all of our technology to China and allowing China to become the largest superpower on earth. And they've now joined with Russia instead of us. Our dummy. And so now we're going to pay the price. So that's all I have to say, Shell. So that's about it for my discussion today, if you don't mind.
No, I don't mind. It was a wonderful discussion. So glad that you came and brought all that to us today. And we look forward to your program tonight. And everybody go visit Sefer Academy. I've got a program there. I've got a class there.
Yes,
Dr.
you do. Your Hebrew class is outstanding, Shell.
We've got lots of great classes there. So hopefully everybody will come and see it. All right.
Thank you, Shell.
Well, thank you, Dr. Pidgeon. And I look forward to your program tonight.
Okay. We'll see you then.
All righty. Shalom, everyone.
Shalom.